everyone, I'm Linda Nickell and welcome to another session of my Happiness Hour. My goal here is to help us all connect, inspire, and create. We do this every Wednesday night live here on Zoom with a new topic and a new speaker. On Tuesdays, I post a list of upcoming presentations to my Instagram page at Cousin Linda and on my website at lindanickell.com. And that's where you're going to find our previous sessions linked to YouTube. Erin Randall is keeping things running for us from Montana. So say hello, Erin.
Hello, Erin.
Our guest this evening is Jon Fischer, who is joining us from North Texas. Jon is a nature and landscape photographer who travels to some of the most iconic locations in our national parks. And he spends an equal amount of time looking for gems on those less familiar back roads around the country. Jon is a bit of a perfectionist, so he knows how to get it right in the camera, but he applies an artist's touch to fully develop his final images, which kind of makes sense because his mission statement, where nature and art meet, perfectly defines the work he is doing. For his post-processing work, Jon uses Photoshop and offers one-on-one tutorials. And tonight, he's going to introduce us to the cornerstones of what makes Photoshop such a powerful tool for photographers. So Jon, welcome to the Happiness Hour community.
Thank you very much.
I really appreciate you tackling this topic for us. This is, I'm a little nervous because I know very, very little about Photoshop. So dumb it down for me.
I will do my best. I was there once as well. I know the first time I started looking into Photoshop, and even before that with GIMP, it was just a free version, I was overwhelmed really quickly. So everybody's been there at the beginning. There is always a way forward, and I'm going to try my best to, take that first step with everybody this evening. Thank you, Linda, for that great introduction, and welcome everyone to a great evening with Cousin Linda's Happiness Hour. I hope you find what we've got planned this evening educational and hopefully a little bit of fun as well. As Linda said, I am a landscape and nature photographer based in the North Dallas area, and I really started photography just as a reason to get outdoors. But as I typically tend to do, I took it a little bit too far and have now traveled far and wide across this country and to far reaches of the globe to find the most beautiful and awe-inspiring places. What I try to do when I'm somewhere is not only to capture the place as I see it, but as I feel it. But when I came home with some of these images, I really couldn't see the emotions that I was feeling when I was there. The camera did a great job at capturing the light and the colors and the textures of the place, but not how I really felt. And as I started trying to do more and more editing, I started running into more and more problems of just not being able to find the way to instill the emotions in my images that I wanted the viewer to feel. And after many, many tutorials and reading online and all over the place, I just finally came to the realization I was going to have to learn Photoshop. And probably like many of you, it was a very daunting task. So it's my hope this evening to help some of you take that first small step into figuring out the basic parts of the application in ways that you aren't so overwhelmed when you watch another tutorial that tells you to do X, Y, Z, and you're like, that's not quite what I need to do, but it's kind of there. The best way to learn is to really get the fundamentals down, whether that be in music, in painting, photography, or post-processing. So that's really what we're going to try to do this evening through a set of slides first that kind of walks us through the three big cornerstones of the application. That is layers, selections, and masks. And then we'll get into some practical demonstrations to kind of see how these things work together and on their own to do some really creative effects. And with that, let me start sharing here. As I was saying, the fundamentals of Photoshop really are these three core elements: layers, selections, and masks. Unlike Lightroom, on one hand, is really a part of the process that is a non-destructive raw image editor and a cataloging system, but it really doesn't have the same power and flexibility that I found that Photoshop does. Photoshop really allows us to have full creative manipulation controls over an image down to the individual pixels, and lets us select and really focus in on one area or the whole image in ways that other image editors really can't allow us to do. Yes, it's a very daunting set of tasks and tools, but if you boil it down just to trying to figure out what you're trying to change and how to do it one step at a time, it really can just start to flow and you don't get overwhelmed quite as easily. So in total, Lightroom and Photoshop are not replacements for one another, at least as far as I'm concerned. They're two parts in a complete and total editing workflow that I use on every single image. So the real key here is learning the tools and using them in ways that are correct for your image and not just following the recipe that somebody else came up with. But the real question is, why do we want to use Photoshop? Yes, Lightroom has some fantastic editing tools. It has great ways to correct and adjust your raw images into something that's more like what you saw. There are still limitations of what Lightroom can do. It has some areas of its abilities abstracted away to make it more easy to use, where Photoshop really lets you have that full control, but the full responsibility of doing it kind of on your own. But some of the things that Photoshop can do that Lightroom doesn't quite be able to do for you as easily is really in the realm of selective editing, being able to select exactly what areas of the photo you want to edit and only those areas to edit, be able to combine multiple images in ways that are fully under control yourself. Yes, Lightroom has HDR and panoramic abilities, but really it does it for you in ways that aren't always natural. Or in Photoshop, since you're in full control of what's happening and how it's being done, you can say exactly what parts of the image you want to come from one area or another area of an image to really create realistic HDR, for lack of a better word, exposure blending to really see all of the image you want to, regardless of how bad the camera was able to capture it in a single image. Another thing Photoshop's really good at is a technique called dodging and burning. This allows us to add more dimension, more light, color, and depth to an image that otherwise might have been lost in the technical capture of the photo, where your eyes might have seen it in a much different way. It really lets us to add that dimension to an image for the greatest effect and flexibility. To show this demonstrate, how this compares, on the left of this slide, I have a frame that I took way back in, I believe this is 2015, with a single exposure up here in Mount Hood, and I couldn't get both the rocks in the foreground and the mountain in the background in sharp focus. What I really needed to be able to do is to blend those two images together in what's called a focus stack. But at the time, I didn't know what a focus stack was. I just thought you were kind of limited to what the camera could do. And I did my best to say, the mountain is what's really the focal point of this image, so it should be sharp. And I tried my best to stop down to where the rock was in reasonable focus. The other problem on this left frame is the sky really kind of got blown out. I did my best to recover it, but it's just kind of bland. Yes, it was just a blue sky, but you really could have gotten a lot more color of that sky if I hadn't nearly blown out the sky. Comparatively, on the right here, we have an image I took just this last spring in Death Valley, where I use a lot of the techniques that I've developed over the last couple of years and really leverage the full flexibility and abilities of Photoshop to get not only the exposure sharp all the way from the front to the back, using over 8 different images to get everything in focus, but I was able also to get the foreground lit with longer exposures, but also get this great Milky Way sky in the background properly exposed without a lot of star trailing, with a shorter exposure at a higher ISO. This allowed me not only to get a lot of detail very cleanly in the foreground with a lower ISO, but also get the sky what you need to do for astrophotography. So how do we do all these things? I'm probably already way over everyone's head and you're just shaking your head. You'll never figure this out. Well, if we start down at the basics, everything then starts to build up, and you don't start any lower than your base layers. When you bring a photo out of Lightroom and into Photoshop for the first time, what you're going to start with is this background image layer down here at the bottom of this image on the right. That is basically the print of your photo came from Lightroom into Photoshop. As we develop and start to process this photo, we're going to get more and more layers that stack above that background layer as we change things such as contrast, color, maybe fix some things as distracting elements we can clone out and do some other things. However, if we do these directly to the background layer, it's destructive. Anything we do directly to a layer, the only way to undo it is to make another change or to use the undo button all the way back through history, undoing who knows how many things you really wanted to keep. Being able to do things in multiple layers basically gives us not only a way to stack effects, but also have things that places we can kind of step back to if something goes awry and we want to change something. There's really two types of layers we deal with. The pixel layers, which is everything you see. It's the canvas we either have our image on or able to paint on so it doesn't actually affect the actual image layer below it. Adjustment layers change how we see it. Some of the types of adjustment layers are things like curves, levels, which is another type of thing that we can add and adjust contrast with. Just a standard exposure adjustment. We can also change the hue and saturation of an image, the color balance, which is your whites and or your warms and cools, magentas or teals, things like that. Or a photo filter, which kind of replicates the photo filters you'd have in a film camera, adding a cooling filter, a warming filter, or even just a general color filter. Another way we can make two layers interact is with what we call a layer style, and also with opacity. Opacity is just how much of that layer is visible. If you turn opacity down, only a part of that image, of that layer, is going to be seen, and you can start seeing something behind it. Layer styles, on the other hand, changes how two layers interact. There are several different types of layer styles. Some are just simple, like lighten. If the pixel above is lighter, it gets used. If the pixel below is lighter, it gets used. There's other types of layer styles, such as overlay and soft light, that have some more specialized use that we can do things with to actually paint in light or add in contrast or use for dodging and burning. That's great if you just want to change the whole part of the image. But a lot of times you just want to affect one area. If you didn't want to affect one area or portions of an image, you'd probably just stay in Lightroom. That's when we can start using selections. When a selection is active, only what's inside the selection can be modified. If I had a selection active, such as this round one over here on the right, I could paint all day long in the top right corner and nothing would happen because that area is not selected. You can do lots of things with selections, but it really comes down to helping you paint within the lines. You know exactly what's going to be affected and helps you control what's not going to be affected by either doing things like painting in an area, by filling an area with color for a vignette, or some other really interesting things you can do, such as sky replacements, and just making a selection if you want to create a mask, which is another thing we'll get into here in a moment. There's several different types of selections. The simplest are either your round or rectangular marquees, which the round one is demonstrated here over on the right. There's also the lasso, which kind of lets you either just freehand draw a shape, or there's also a polygon lasso that kind of lets you draw some sort of a polygon, which I kind of use sometimes to replicate light streaming through a scene. If there's a forest scene, I want to make it feel like lights, streaming through a little bit of haze. A polygon marquee or lasso can help you kind of create that effect and kind of outline where you want these light streams to go, and then you can paint through there either with a gradient or some other tools to kind of affect that. We'll have a great demonstration of that here in a little bit. Now, once you have a selection, this section up at the top here above the image is how you can also modify either when you're creating or adding to a selection. You have what type of selection you're doing over here on the far left, and then some different tools of how you're going to either create a new one, add to it, subtract from it, or the difference. These are all just different types of tools to help you refine and build whatever type of selection you really need. Now, the third and final real cornerstone is masks. And masks are really probably one of those things that really stops a lot of people in their tracks the first time they interact with it. I know it did when I started doing Photoshop. It was like, what is this mask thing? Everybody uses them. I don't understand how these things work together. But the simple explanation is that where a mask is white, you see that layer, and where a mask is black, you don't see that layer. It basically turns that area of your layer, your layer, on and off. So you can basically either just paint in around the top area if you added some contrast and you wanted to add that contrast just to the top or the bottom of the image, or you can use it to, blend in multiple exposures, either for a sky that it was a little bit different exposure, or if you had multiple exposures of, say, a stream, and you wanted to get a little bit of this shot of the stream that looked a little bit better in one image and add it to another one. That's really a great way and time to use a mask. Now, masks are going to be applied to a lot of different things. You can apply them to a pixel layer, and when you create an adjustment layer, you'll automatically get a white mask already attached to it. And you can also group multiple layers together and add a mask to that. That means if you have a really complex mask on multiple layers and you want to, say, then turn off all those layers in a section of all of those layers, you don't have to go in and modify each one of those layers and masks individually. You can just group them up, apply a mask to that whole group, and then either add or subtract to that group, and it adds those masks together. It only shows where white is there all the way down from the group and the individual things. Now, how do you want to create and modify a mask? Think of it this way. Anything you can do to a monochrome pixel layer, you can do to a mask. That means you can paint on it, which is probably the simplest way to modify a mask. You can do adjustments to it, which means you can increase contrast. You can make white, slightly gray if you wanted to reduce how much of the layer is going in, but you still want that mask to be there. And you can use things called luminosity masks, and you can also create your masks based on selections. We'll have a great example of that also here when I get into the demo. Here's what you'll see when you get into Photoshop and dealing with masks. Over here on the far right, we have a mask attached to this photo filter 1, and it's highlighted around here in this white set of boxes. That means that is what is currently selected, and if you were to paint on your image, this is what would be modified. Always keep tabs of what thing is selected most of the times when you're working in Photoshop, because a lot of times I'll be working along and I'm like, why isn't this working? And I realize I'm modifying a mask on a different layer than I'm looking at, or I'm drawing on a layer that I didn't intend to. So as you're editing, do keep track of what you've actually got selected if you're bouncing back and forth a little bit. Now, as you'll see here, the icon, especially when you actually get into Photoshop, is quite small of what your mask looks like. If you want to see what your mask looks like full screen, all you have to do is hit Alt and click on the icon of the mask, and it'll bring you up full screen where your image typically is. Now, to get out of this, all you have to do is click anywhere outside that icon, and it'll kick you back over to just your preview of your image as you're seeing it normally. So enough of the walkthrough of the different types. I think it'd be great for us to get into some demonstration of how these things work individually and together. All right. I know this is not the most interesting image to start with, but it's a really great demonstration of how some of these things work together. What we have here is just a set of bars that demonstrate your black, your shadows, kind of mid shadows, your midtones, which is a 50% gray, your highlights, and whites. The one on the right is pure white, and the one on the black is pure black. That's going to be important as we move forward here in a moment. Now, what I also have here is the exact inverse of that image, which I have in the wrong blend mode already. So here's our inverse. So now black is on the right and white is on the left. Now, as you saw before I changed it, if we change the blend mode of these things, changes how these two layers interact. If I go back to our lighten mode, now you'll see that because the white on both sides is the brightest, it uses the white from one layer and the white from another. And likewise, our highlights from one layer and the other are selected. And it just kind of decides which mid-tone to use because they're exactly the same. Now, lighten has a similar inverse function as called darken, which is up above, which is the exact same thing as lighten, only it picks the darker frame. We also have different things for adding contrast, which are these third set down here. These are really useful, the overlay and soft light, which I mentioned earlier, for doing things such as dodging and burning, adding light, and just really adding a nice contrast set of features to your image. Overall, there's 5 sets here. The top is your normal. You'll probably never use dissolve. So normal is just the pixel as it is. The next set down is your darken set. The next set down after that are things that lighten your image. And the next one down from here are things that add contrast. These both affect the highlights and the shadows of the image. And then we have some special case type features, blend modes down here, which for photography really aren't that useful. Difference obviously takes the difference. Since the difference between 50% gray and 50% gray is technically 0, it displays black. And because the difference between black and white is the exact far reaches of the hue spectrum, it'll display white. Subtract basically subtracts the two, divide divides the two. If these sound like math terms, they are. All of these things really work off of math. Most of them are just simple, either multiplication, addition, and generally just very simple, mathematical equations that you really don't have to fully understand, other than know that's kind of what's behind the scenes, just some simple math. This last set down here below is just kind of a different set. Either is just going to take the hue from the top layer, the saturation from the top layer, the color from the top layer, or the luminosity. These are really great for when you want to just add a little bit of color or something you want to affect it in some way, but not get any of the saturation or some other areas of the image from the one below it, and you want to use that instead. Now, to do something more, a little more interesting than just black and white bars, let's make some color bars. Yes, I know it's not that much more interesting, but we can kind of see some different effects, whether we're using darken, which just takes the darker color, which is a very sharp edge, as you see, versus when you're using darker color, is a slightly different effect. Same way with lighten, you actually get some gradation of the green and the red, whether we're using lighter color, it's just an on or off type of switch. Now with color, you can kind of see what we're talking about with these overlay and soft light differences. Overlay is a much more contrast heavy difference. It will add a lot of punch, a lot of brightness or darkness, depending on whether we're using a darker or lighter color than what the colors underneath it. Where soft light is a much more gentle effect. This really comes in handy when you're trying to highlight different areas, doing dodging and burning, or really punch up certain areas of your photo to draw attention to those, or really make them recede into the background where the eye doesn't get drawn to them. Now, there's a special color called 50% gray. It means it's 50% gray. What's so important about that? When we're dealing with overlay layers, 50% gray and also soft light don't do anything. It means because it's a contrast adjustment and you're using 50% gray, it means you're not moving it to the left or right. It just stays the same. This is really great because if you paint on a layer that's 50% gray with something that's not 50% gray, let me get a nice larger or much smaller pixel here, brush. We paint across the top in something very, there we go. So you'll see we're not affecting our whites or blacks with this soft light layer, but we are painting in the middle. Now, if you wanted to see that you had actually painted over here, at any time you could just change this back to normal and see exactly where you painted. If you're doing a lot of dodging and burning and you want to see exactly what you've done, having this layer set to 50% soft light or 50% gray It'll switch back to normal, gives you a really quick demonstration of what you've painted either in a darker or a lighter color. Now, let's get into a couple of adjustment layers and then we'll dive into some more interesting images that I have on deck. Now, levels and curves are two adjustment layers that let you control the contrast. Levels is a little bit simpler and it's probably the one that you want to start with first, but curves gives you a little more flexibility, just kind of like the difference between Lightroom and Photoshop. Now, with levels, if you grab here on this top right little notch here and you drag it to the left, as soon as you get past this notch that's showing as our, oh, I don't have it turned on. There we go. Now, as we drag, as soon as you go past our first line here, which is representing our highlights, as soon as you go past that, our highlights is now inside our white point, which means it's pure white. Likewise, if you did the same thing to your blacks over here and you dragged it inward, as soon as you crossed over, our shadows is now pure black. If you drag the middle one way or another, you can affect what's your midtones. It's a great way to very quickly, set your white and black points of your image and also affect the overall contrast based on that midpoint of the luminosity. Now, these sets down here kind of do the inverse of the notch above it. If you drag this up, it makes your blacks less black. And if you drag this one over, it makes your whites a little less white and more into your highlights. This is great if you're almost just quite not clipping and you want to get a little more room to do some adjustments. You bring this down just a little bit. You get a little bit, not quite on that edge of white where you're blowing things out in your image. Apparently my computer's going to restart, even though I told Windows not to tell me about that for the next couple days. Now, one last thing we're going to look at real quick before we get into something more interesting is the hue and saturation adjustment. This is a color type of adjustment, which, because we're looking at something black and white, really can't do much unless we check this box called Colorize. That just basically says, use this actual color to paint into the area. Now we can kind of see as we drag the hue across, as we change the hue that's being painted in. And of course, also your saturation up and down of how much of that paint you want to paint in, and lightness. I use hue and saturation sometimes just to bring the whole saturation down of an area a little bit. I'll mask in, or I'll use a couple other tools, but hue and saturation is great for doing a general saturation move one direction or another, and then mask it in exactly where you want it, especially if it's an area that's a fairly large area. Say you want to bring the saturation of your sky down just a little bit if it got a little too more blue as you're doing some contrast work. You want to keep it a little more natural. You can just bring the saturation down a few points, make this a black mask, paint in where you want that mask, that adjustment to be just in your sky. That way your foreground stays nice and rich and colorful, but your sky stays realistic and not so vividly blue that no one's going to believe it was a real thing that you saw. So enough of the standard issues, stock stuff. Let's jump into something a little more interesting. Okay. Say we want to make a star trail and all we know how to do is deal with layers. If we create a whole bunch of images taken 30 seconds at a time, and if we zoom in here a little bit, you can see that the stars move just a little bit in those 30 seconds because we are actually moving quite quickly through space and the stars move faster than you would think they would until you get out there and actually try to take pictures of the stars when they're not moving. But now that we've got a set of photos, there's 40 of them here, which means it's about 20 minutes of total time. We want to make a star trail really quickly and easily. If we leave our bottom layer alone and grab every layer other than that all the way up here to the top, and we're going to exclude this one right there. So we're going to grab all of these that are enabled, and all we're going to do is change it to the lighten blend mode that we were talking about earlier. This means that every pixel, as it's being compared to the one below it, it says if I'm brighter, I get used. So we have a cascading effect. As that star moves, it is now the one that's brightest, and it gets seen all the way from the bottom all the way up, and we get a really quick and easy star trail. Now, you could, if you had a nice exposured foreground, this would be all you'd have to do. But since this wasn't the greatest amount of color on this church, and I actually have a frame where cars pass by, and we got a lot more detail, we can actually add this as a foreground, masked out, so where all we can get is the foreground and the background remains our sky that we had below it. The quickest and easiest way to do this is with our quick selection tool. I'm going to try to start on the bottom and select just the church in the foreground. If I go slowly and make sure I don't go outside the church, Photoshop should do a pretty good job of the selection. I think that did a pretty good job, except for this area over here that for some reason, as many times as I do this mask, it never gets this little corner over here. What you can do is come up here and we want to add to the selection. So it's this middle button up here, which is our add. And just very carefully come and stay just on the inside, and Photoshop will take another attempt at selecting that. Now the reason it doesn't do a great job is because this area is almost the exact same luminosity as this color, and there's not a lot of contrast. This tool really works off of contrast, and if you don't have a lot, it's going to have a hard time. But if you keep at it and use the correct tools, eventually you'll get something pretty close. We don't have to be exact here because we're actually using an image that hasn't moved. If you're doing something like a sky replacement or some other things, you'd want to be a lot more diligent in getting a perfect selection, but that should be good enough for us. Now that we've got this selection, you remember that the only things that are inside the selection will be modified. So if we just come down here to our Add Layer Mask icon, which is the third one from the left, it's got a nice little tooltip here if you hover over it long enough and click on it, it'll immediately create a mask that is white where the selection was and black everywhere else. And now we have our foreground of our layer and we have our sky. Now, before we move on, there's one thing we'd like to be able to do and really kind of fix this really kind of hard edge here that we have on the right. So we're going to modify this mask real quick with just an easy brush. We'll make it a little bit bigger. And let's make the opacity and flow maybe around 50. I usually keep these about the same. There are a slight difference between opacity and flow. I usually don't pay attention to the difference because I just keep them kind of the same area and just paint this time with the correct color until I get the effect I want. And then if it's too strong or too light of an effect, I just modify the flow and opacity until I get what I want. Okay, that's looking pretty good, but I want to get a little bit more exposure on this front church a little bit. I know this last layer that we used for our star trails actually was a little bit brighter on the front of the church. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Control and J to duplicate that. So now we have a copy of this last layer. I'm going to drag it on top of everything. And now that brightened. Just basically because it's still on a lighten mode, it says, was the church below it darker or lighter than this frame? And because it was lighter on this frame, it gets used. Now, what it is a little bit colored, probably because this is actually a brake light. So we got a little bit of red cast. We'll do one more adjustment layer to try to fix a little bit of that. Let's use a color balance. Now, this is the different adjustments you have on your color balance adjustment. You can come in here. The best thing to do is just get in here and slide them left and right. You actually have ways you can control not only the shadows, midtones, and highlights for each area of this thing. We're just going to grab the midtones and we're going to make this a little bit more cyan, a little bit more blue. And right now it's affecting the whole photo, which we really don't want it to. But as soon as we get this thing kind of in the realm we want to for just the front of our church, we will duplicate this mask. So what I can do is, I believe it's Alt, and you're just going to drag it. As we're clicking Alt, drag it up to the layer we want to duplicate it. And it says, do you want to replace the layer mask, our pure white one, with this one? Yes. Now it's showing us where this last mask is, which we don't really need. So we're just going to click somewhere until it goes away. There we go. Now we've got this adjustment layer for the color balance, only affecting the lower area of the frame, the same place we had used the mask for our church shot. And now we got a nice white balance. Now, the last thing we'll do before we move on is a layers adjustment. I created this one earlier. Actually, it's a levels adjustment, not a layers adjustment. And all I've done here, we'll click on it before I turn it on, is dragged it from when it normally starts at 1, we just drag it over to the left a little bit to bring our midtones, what used to be in the middle, now it says this area over here, which was a little bit darker, is now it's going to be mid-tone. That's all that layer adjustment is going to do. And if I turn this back on, it just brightens over the entire image just a little bit. If we wanted to just do this in the foreground, we could do the same thing as we did. Just drag the layer up, mask up, and replace it. But I think overall that looks pretty good. Now it's a great way to just do a quick and easy star trail. A couple little adjustments to make our foreground a little more stand out from the rest of the image and have a nice exposure overall. Our histogram is still kind of bunched over the right, but what are you going to say? It's at night.
And Mika is asking, do you usually use the quick selection tool?
I do when the selection is really quite easy. There are other ways of making a lot more precise selections. But if this, if it's a relatively easy horizon, if I don't have a lot of trees or different things like that to deal with, I'll just use the quick selection tool. The next example over, the quick selection tool will also work. I'll probably use it, but I'll probably modify the selection just a little bit because sometimes it doesn't get right on the edge. And if you have an area of a real big contrast, it'll actually add a halo, which is probably what we were seeing some of over here on the far left before I painted the softer transition in. And if we zoom in, you'll probably see in some areas where the selection wasn't perfect, but it gets you pretty close pretty quickly, and then you can refine it from there.
Okay. And the question I have is, I'm seeing all of the files as JPEGs.
Yes.
Okay. And I know that you shoot RAW.
I do.
So explain why there's all
I
these
did this so that my computer wouldn't completely implode trying to do the screen share and do this at the same time. I would normally pull these all in from RAWs or TIFFs and do that. But in the sake of image size and hardware limitations, I went with JPEGs this time, yes.
Okay.
All right. So that's a great way to do that star trail. And now we'll move on to and do some other things with some layers and masks. This is a shot from an area in Arizona known as White Pocket. This is the morning right before a monstrous storm showed up, and I was scrambling around trying to get as many shots as I could. And we had some really nice side light, but the light was also kind of flat because of the clouds. And I really wanted to create a much more dramatic effect. And this is a really nice example of how you can do some different dodging and burning and some other different effects with some of these layers. The first thing I wanted to do is show you how to do a sky replacement. Because this sky, while it's accurate, it really didn't have the feel of the scene as I remember it. There was a lot of really dramatic clouds building very quickly, and only a few shots after I took this foreground, I came around the side and I saw this sky, which is much more dramatic, has a lot more texture in it. And what I really would like to do is combine these two together so that I have my really interesting foreground with these nice leading lines, but also the sky that I think the image really, feels right with. And it also creates a nice additional leading line through the top of the image. So as I did before, what we'll do is we'll use the quick selection tool to get a selection of the sky. And as usual, I have the wrong layer selected. Whatever layer you have selected, that's what the quick selection tool will use to find the edges, even if it's not the one you're seeing. If you have it turned off, but you have it selected, which is designated by this white box around it, it will use that. So let's come back down to our foreground and try that again. And very quickly, because there's such a good contrast between the foreground and the horizon, the sky, I only had to drag just a little bit and immediately locked to the edges. As I saw someone in the comments mention, there is ways to adjust and modify these selections. On this one, I think it'd be a really good idea to come up to select, modify, and expand 1 pixel just to make sure there's no halo between this really bright area of the sky right along the horizon over here and what will be a much darker area of sky after we put the new sky in. So we're going to expand it by 1 pixel. And we're also going to feather it by 1 pixel just to create just a little bit of a smoother transition. And it looks a little bit better if you zoom way up on it. It just doesn't have that 1 pixel to 1 pixel transition from one image to the other. And then all we got to do again is, since we've got this one selected now and we've got our sky selected, which is what we want to use from this top layer, hit our create layer mask down here at the bottom, turn it back on, and now we have our interesting dark brooding skies up here at the top. And if we zoom in nice and close, we will see, hey, that everything's nice and sharp, but also there's no white halo along this edge from where there was an imprecise selection. So that's a real quick and easy way to do a sky replacement if you've got a really easy and simple horizon. If I had trees coming up through here and some other things, it'd be a little harder to get a good selection. But for this example, it's a really nice way just to drop in a different sky and blend 2 images together really quickly. Next thing I'd like to do is add some more contrast to the foreground. So again, we're going to use a layers adjustment, and to add contrast, bring it to the right just a little bit and it'll darken up the foreground, and you can drag it the other way and bring your whites over, and it'll add just quite a bit of contrast with just a couple of little slider selections. Now your foreground's got quite a bit more contrast. And what I'm doing, I'm clicking the eyeball, if you haven't seen me before, to turn the layer on and off. So that's got some nice darkness, it's real rich colors up in front, but it's probably a little too dark. I'm losing these leading lines of the highlights up in front. So to fix some of that, we'll use a technique called dodging and burning. So we'll get a new layer, an empty pixel layer, change this to the layer blending styles we were talking about earlier of overlay, and we'll select a color that is in the image, so nice, almost white, but just a little bit of color to it, and paint in at a very low opacity and flow. So we're going to change the opacity and flow down to 20% and 20, and just kind of paint in along these highlight white lines just a little bit. Now the way overlay works is it will affect the brighter areas a lot faster than the darker areas around it. So you don't have to be real precise and mask too much in this case as you're coming along here.
I'm sorry, while you're coloring, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Okay, David Wilson is asking, the expand 1 pixel, did it expand into the foreground or did it go into the sky? Same with the feather.
There is, let me get a selection here again. Go back to this. Okay, we got our selection. If we go up to select, modify, and we hit expand, there is a checkbox here that says apply effect at canvas bounds. As long as you're not contracting, you can leave this unchecked. But if you have a sky area and you're contracting the selection, you do want to make sure you check this box so that it doesn't modify along this edge, and then suddenly your selection moves inward, and then whatever you're doing doesn't get affected right along the edge. So there's ways to do either one. When you're expanding, it will go past the edge, but because now we're outside the bounds of the image, it doesn't really matter.
Okay. I didn't want to interrupt your flow, but I thought that was a good question.
That is a very good question.
Yeah, while we're on this image.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, yeah. What I'm really trying to do is just highlight these leading lines that are already in the rock. And by using I'm painting on the wrong layer. The overlay, it's affecting the areas that are already bright a lot faster than the shadow areas. So just with this low opacity, you can really just paint in. I mean, I can spend hours doing this. It's probably doing a little too slowly to really show an effect. I'll turn it off here in a second. We can see what it's doing. Oh, you know what I'm doing? I still have a selection active. So as we were discussing, anything you are doing outside of a selection does absolutely nothing. So we want to deselect this, remove the selection. So that's just Control and D to deactivate the selection. And I can come back down here and continue to dodge and burn. And just following the natural highlights of what was already there. We're just bringing up the foreground interest just in a few areas to accentuate the details of these rocks and just kind of help draw the eye inwards and upwards into these nice formations. Zoom back out where you can see everything. That is the on and off for that. It's subtle, but it definitely helps add contrast and interest to the overall image. Bring this up just a little more. Try and make it a little more obvious for people on smaller screens.
So are you using the dodge and burn tool on performing?
No, what I'm using is a blank layer that I created set to overlay. Okay. This is a technique called dodging and burning in color because I can actually choose a color to add not only brightness by selecting a bright hue, but also adding a little bit of saturation in addition to brightness. One thing you'll find when you're doing dodging and burning with just black and white techniques is that when you're brightening things up, the saturation can kind of get drained out a little bit because you're adding so much brightness. By doing this, adding a little bit of color to whatever you're painting in, kind of balances that loss of saturation. So you still have the color in there. Also, you can have more of a saturated color and actually add to the color that you're putting into the image that was already there.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, absolutely. I'm just gonna kind of paint over these tops just a little bit. All right, now we can turn this off and on. And you can see a lot more how that really accentuated the different colors and the striata in the rocks that was there and helps draw the eye upwards and inwards into the image. Now, if we want to darken the sky a little bit, we can do the same technique. This time, I'm going to set this to soft light so that the effect isn't quite as sharp and contrasty. Get another color, this time out of the sky, just using my eyedropper, which is holding down the Alt key and just dragging anywhere. It'll show you what color you're selecting. And then we're going to make a dark version of that that's somewhat desaturated and still the same opacity and flow. Make a much larger brush and paint up here just to kind of darken up the sky. Now, in all images, your eyes are drawn to two things, warmth and luminosity. Anything that's bright and warm is where your eye is going to linger the longest. So that's why we want this leading line to be bright and obviously warm because of this nice red rock. But you don't want the eye to just continue up and off the top of the frame. So by adding just a little bit of extra darkness up here, you're adding some more interest and contrast and more darkness to just really drive home the feeling of this storm that was gathering, but also keeping the viewer's eye within the image. So if I turn everything on and off here, you can see where we started here with just kind of a flat image with kind of a blown out sky to a much richer, more contrasty image with a sky that really, to me, makes it feel like what it was when I was there. Any additional questions I can answer before we move on to the last example?
I'm going to let you go to your last example because some of the questions I'm holding back are general,
Okay.
and we can get those at the end if you don't mind.
Perfect. Yeah. I'm not going to go all the way through this one because I could definitely, I think when I edited this image, I think I did it 3 times before I was happy with it. But also, I think it took me about an hour each time I did the edit. Linda, you'll remember this image.
No, tell us where it is, John.
This is in Arkansas. It's a little stream. It's probably a stream that's most of the year quite dry, but we had all had quite a bit of rain the night before. So this little stream was flowing quite nicely with a lot of very slick moss, as more than one person in this call would be able to attest to. But we all made it out without damaged gear and some really awesome images. But for me, the real lacking of this image that I really wanted to convey when I was doing the edit was the feeling of the light and the almost ethereal feel that I thought the day had, because it was kind of mid-morning, but still had some nice, interesting light to it. I just really wanted to bring that back to the image. So I'm going to get into a slightly more advanced technique here for just a moment and introduce what's called luminosity masking. Now, luminosity masking is nothing more than creating a mask that is based on the luminosity of the image. So basically, you're creating a mask that is the black and white version of the image. So say we wanted to make the stream areas of this image more blue, all these highlight, areas more blue. To do this manually, we'll do this once manually. We'll first create a just white mask from the add layer mask to have it here. We can come up to image and just click on apply image. Because I've got the layer mask selected over here, when I do apply image, what it will do is create a black and white version of that image to that mask. I'll take a minute to do that. And if I hit Alt and click, as I was showed on the slides earlier, here is the mask that technique created. It is a direct black and white rendition of the image, but it's probably a little too selective in some of the areas we don't want whatever we're adding to it to be. So again, because you can do anything to a layer mask that you can do it to a pixel layer, what I will do is add some contrast to this so that the darker areas are less revealing and the brighter areas are a little more revealed. So we'll just come up here to image adjustments, levels. We have to do this directly to the layer instead of a layer adjustment layer because we're trying to affect the actual mask. So what we'll do is we'll just drag this over, other direction. So we get a mask that is just the highlights of the stream. And I also don't want it to affect this up in here, so we're going to modify this in another way by creating a gradient, make this 100% opacity, and just drag it down here, and we'll just take it, just gradient right out of the sky. So whatever we're going to add to this thing here, we don't want it to affect the sky, and we only want it to affect what's up here. And of course I did this out of order, but we will work with it the same. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a photo filter, cooling filter, and we're going to move the mask up to here. Now, if without the mask, turn this mask, there it is. Without the mask, everything gets this cooling photo filter. When I turn it back on, only this brightest area gets this cooling effect. So that's one way that I do a lot of very, very specific and targeted adjustments as I'm going through different things, as I use a lot of these what's called luminosity masks. And there's a lot of different panels out there and little different additional tools that lets you do this really quickly without having to remember to do the right order of things, of creating your layer, then going to apply image, then modifying it, and all these manual steps. The panel that I use is the TK Rapid Mask, and it very quickly lets you just create the preview just like we had before, as soon as it gets through these calculations. This is the same preview that we had before when I did the apply image, but now it is, I can just come down here to layer, and if we wanted to add another photo filter, just click on photo filter, and it automatically makes that layer with the mask applied automatically. So that's one tool that I do use that speeds up my processing quite a bit, because I do a lot with luminosity masks now. In addition to manual masks, it's all up to what the situation and the problem I'm trying to solve requires, whether I'm using a luminosity mask or a manual mask or one I've created based on a selection. Let's get rid of that because we don't need it. So now we've...
Real quick, since you said it, I'm going to ask it.
Yes.
Is the mask a plugin?
The TK Rapid Mask, yes. This is a plugin that is available. It's quite cheap. I don't remember the exact price. There's also Lumenzia is another luminosity mask panel that's out there. Both of them are very, very good. I know a lot of people use both. I started using the TK panel just because it's probably the first one I was introduced to, probably on a tutorial from someone, Nick Page, whoever it was, when I was watching tutorials, and I really wanted to start getting into luminosity masks and kind of understand what they could bring to the editing process. And after seeing it and working with it, it's the one I've stuck with. I like its layout and its ease of use more than some of the other ones that I've seen. And I do plan on doing a whole article on the panel here on my website here fairly soon. So hopefully I'll have some more information in addition to what we're going to go over tonight. But one thing I should also want to show, in addition to being able to do dodge and burning with the layers, is being able to add light to up in here in the top. You know, just kind of get a feel of this kind of soft, gentle light. Right now, this top area is a little bit busy, and just, yeah, it's too busy. It's more than anything. Similar to what we were doing with the dodging and burning to add dimension, is you can also just kind of paint in light. I typically do this with a soft light color. We want to grab a color that's kind of similar to what's already in the image. So we're going to use our eye picker again and pick, you know, a nice kind of orangey yellow. And this one we're just going to paint up here in the top, fairly low. I'll bring it up just a little bit so that you can kind of see it, and just kind of a swirling effect. Just kind of paint in a feeling of glowing light up here in the top. And just that little bit, you've given the eye somewhere to go to, but when it gets there, it's not that really jumbled, tangled mess of twigs and everything that was there when it was a lot more contrast heavy. There's lots of different ways you can add this effect. A lot of times I'll paint it in just so I can kind of feather things and kind of make it directional. Sometimes I'll just drag it, you know, down and through a little bit, just kind of make it feel like there's streams of light coming through. And as long as you do this in a really low opacity, you can kind of get away with it to where, unless you turn it on and off here and there, you'll see where it's really affecting. But turning it on and off also lets you see where you've gotten a little heavy-handed with it, where you might want to come back down and remove it a little bit, probably right in here. There we go. So with just that one little layer, we really added a nice softness and glow to the top of the image. Another nice thing that adds depth to your image is to have what's further back in the image less contrast heavy than what's in the front. That adds a feeling of dimension and depth to the image that cameras sometimes can lose, being, again, they're just tools and just capturing light that's there. But if you really want to create an image that has three-dimensional, just by creating one layer with just a little bit of painting on it set to soft light. We've created this, glowing effect that adds depth to the image and a warmth that helps draw the eye from this foreground interest of the stream, and it kind of gives it a place for the eye to go through the image. How are we doing on time? I think we're just about out, aren't we?
We're great, but just because it's Michael Rung's birthday and I know he's in the audience, can you show me exactly where he fell on his bottom?
I think it's actually out of frame on this photo.
It is. It's out of frame. We can move on.
Well, wait a minute.
Happy birthday, Michael. And to be fair, I fell in the exact same spot not a minute and a half later, trying to come down the exact same rock. And I even told myself, I will go down the part that looks drier. Apparently, it wasn't dry enough.
And Linda said, I'm smarter and prettier than them. Don't go over there. So, all right. Are you finished here? And I'm going to ask you a couple of questions that I've got.
I am. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on the final edit of this photo, kind of see where everything went to.
Yes.
The same sort of effect we were starting up there, I just made it a lot stronger to even make it even more kind of a glow effect. And we added a lot more dodging and burning through the foreground to make more three-dimensionality of the rocks and add some more interest to the foreground. So there is we turn this one off. So that was where we basically started, and that was my final edit on that one. Just using a whole lot of the 3 tools that we talked about tonight. Layers, there's probably a dozen layers here of different types. A lot of masks, and some of those were created with selections.
John, that is probably one of my favorite images that you did from that trip.
It is one of my favorites.
Every time I look at it, I think, why didn't I walk over there? And then I remember, a little slippery. If they are going to fall, I'm really going to be in trouble.
Yeah.
So, okay. So let me hit you with a couple of questions. Okay. So Jamie Wagner wants to know, do you use Bridge to organize, or do you manage your workflow some other way?
I do all of my cataloging and initial raw edits in Lightroom. Then I export from Lightroom directly into Photoshop, and I do all my creative edits there. What's nice is that Lightroom maintains a connection when you open them from Lightroom into Photoshop. When you save your final in Photoshop, it automatically adds it to your Lightroom catalog, and it sets it right next to your RAWs.
This is the question I want to know.
Okay.
And I kind of know the answer. So Meredith wants to know, how long do you generally spend on an image? And so she says, the details are remarkable. I realize there may be a huge variations depending on complexity of the image, but
there are.
Yeah.
But
generally,
I get through the raw edit probably in 10, 15 minutes. The Photoshop side of things, some images take another 10 to 15 minutes. Other ones I will spend hours on. I've got ones that I've got to the end of the edit. I've saved it. I've come back the next day, hated what it ended up looking like, started back at the very bottom layer and just started clicking through the layers to kind of see where things went off the rails. And sometimes it's like the 3rd layer up. I'll delete every layer above that, throw it to the side. Sometimes I'll put it in a group so I can go back to see, make sure I'm not going down the same path later down in the second edit, and do a whole nother edit from there. Sometimes I'll do that 2 or 3 times. I've got images that I have a V4, V5 of that after sitting on it for a couple of days, coming back to it, just something about it didn't jive with me, and I'll start over again.
So how do you know when to stop?
When I sleep on it, I come back to it and I'm still happy with it.
Okay. So Jamie wants to know, how in the heck do you remember all of this?
I do it a lot. I am both blessed and cursed. I'm a bit of a perfectionist and technically minded. So I do kind of maintain the technical aspects of things a little bit. But if I don't do a technique for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, sometimes I'll come back and I'll forget that how I did something. And I'll be working on something very similar. I'll be like, okay, same problem. How did I do that before? But knowing the building blocks of the 3 kind of cornerstones that we've been talking about lets me kind of put together a solution out of those pieces. And I just kind of keep tweaking at it until I get a solution that's happy with, or I'll come back and just, throw it off to the side a day later and start over.
So I don't know Judy, but I think Judy this idea is brilliant. So I'm going to throw it at you.
Okay.
And I want to say Judy Keown, I'm not sure, but Judy, this is brilliant. So Jon, make this happen. She'd like to know, can we do an edit along with you in a session sometime? So basically, maybe the idea is maybe you would give people a raw file, the same raw file that you're working on, and maybe they could follow along just to kind of
absolutely.
Would that work?
Yeah, we can absolutely do that. I also wanted to mention that anybody mentioning this tutorial, I'm doing a 2 hours for the price of one-on-one. So it's my normal rate is $50 an hour. You guys get 2 for 1 on that one, and we can go through and edit. I can forward a similar shot that you want to work on, or even work on one of yours, and we can do a one-on-one of something, or we can do a presentation like this where I take one of my images that I've worked a couple of times, send it out, and we can do a kind of paint by numbers along the way. Absolutely.
Okay, so you and I will figure out how we can make that happen.
Yes.
So I thought that was going to be my last question for you, but David Wilson is my Facebook friend, and I want all his questions answered.
Okay.
So he says, are you editing a copy from Lightroom to Photoshop? He has the hardest time finding images that I've saved as a PSD back in Lightroom. Any ideas that could help?
Yes, let me get Lightroom up and I'll share for just a second. I'll show you how that works. Let's see here, there we go. Let me share this one. Hopefully that's the right screen. I started a new catalog this year, hoping that it would be faster to start up, but it's still taking time. Probably because I've still got like 17 gigs of stuff in Photoshop open.
Now you're just bragging.
No, it's all those layers. That's why I had to do JPEGs for that star trail. Okay, we'll just use this one since it's right here. If you want to edit in Photoshop from Lightroom, simply right-click, edit in, and edit in Photoshop. Now, hopefully, if I have the right share going. Let's see here. Let's go back over to Photoshop. All right, here's the image. It's now moved that over from Lightroom into Photoshop. We'll just do some really crazy adjustment. We'll just make it black and white so we can obviously see the difference. And if I do nothing else and just hit save, let's go up to File, Save, instead of doing the shortcut. It's going to save that image. Now, if I come back over to Lightroom, it is sitting right next to, bring up the library and the grid so you can see. So here is the image that we came out of Lightroom with, and here is our edit sitting right next to it in the same folder, right next to it in the catalog. That's the best way to do it, is to open in Photoshop from Lightroom so it maintains that connection. And then when you save it, it'll automatically be added to the catalog. I usually do this with a flattened version of my images and save another version with all of the layers to a separate location. Probably don't have to do that. It's just my workflow, thinking that it might be a little faster and easier on Lightroom to not have to open several gig files. But I know Lightroom also maintains their own thumbnails, so that's probably, again, not necessary. It's just how I've been doing it for a long time and maintain doing it.
Great. Okay, you want to take that screen down?
Yes, thank you for reminding me.
Yeah.
All right.
So, do you have any closing words that you want to bestow upon me?
Focus on the three cornerstones and understand how those things interact, and then everything else kind of builds on top of that. You'll watch a lot of tutorials of trying to do certain things and certain techniques, even how I was doing with dodging and burning, the sky replacements, all these different techniques. But if you understand how those three things work and interact with one another, you'll be able to do and come up with solutions to just about anything. And when you're looking up how to do specific things, you'll know the steps to get there, and then you'll be able to branch out from that.
Jon, this is still over my head, but I learned that little plus, negative, positive, whatever brush, and that's all I need from this.
Yes.
I'll add it to my repertoire.
Okay.
So, I want to thank you for coming, and I know that I know how much time you spend on your images, and there's a reason that your images look the way they do compared to mine, and that's okay. But that sky replacement that you did on White Pocket, I was like, wait a minute, that looks a lot easier than I thought it was much more complicated than that. And I kind of know, what Nick Page does, and it seemed complicated, and you really made it easy, or at least
with simple horizons, they are very simple.
Yeah.
When you get really complex horizons, they get a lot more complex. You can use things like luminosity masking and select and mask and some other tools to feather the edges around trees and other things. But a lot of times, start with the simplest ones and build up from there.
Okay. Well, the next time that we are out shooting, remind me, hey, shoot this and we'll play.
Yeah, absolutely.
Jon, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I really appreciate it. Okay, guys, I'm going to wrap this up and say next week, our guest is Robert McGee, who's going to present simple and complex composition. And he will share with us his techniques on using compositional flow and creative storytelling to master composition. So thank you guys for joining us tonight. Until next Wednesday, go out and create something beautiful. And I hope that we will see you again next week.